webinar on net zero waste. It's a webinar brought to you by Regenerative Collaborative. My name is Marloes Reining and I'll be your facilitator today. So for this webinar, we didn't manage to get a sponsor, but if you have ideas or know of people that want to become a sponsor, definitely benefits to it and a lot of reach. So yeah, if you have any ideas, please let us know. We appreciate your input. So this is sort of an overview of all the topics we covered in 2022, and some of them are available on GreenNet, the GreenNet website, as a recording or as a course you can take still for CPD points. So if you want to relook at one of these courses, you can go there. This year, this is the 6th webinar, and we've covered already quite a number of really interesting topics. And today's one is a really nice one in this line. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation. Please join us on or like us on LinkedIn or Eventbrite. So if you on LinkedIn, we will post all the events up front and links to where you can register, and Eventbrite is our registration page. So if you like us there, you get reminders of the upcoming webinars. So please like us there, and Lisette will put in all the links in the chat box so that you can do it now and keep following us. It really helps us. Thanks. In order for us to upload all these recordings of these webinars and to work on the backlogs, we're looking for a video editing intern, social media intern, and a web developer. We've made these internships. So if you know any students fresh out of university or still in university, just let us know and they'll gladly receive their CVs. But today we're talking about net zero waste. We're having two incredible speakers. But before we kick off, just some statistics. So according to the State of Waste report by the DFFE, which is the Department of Forestry and Forest and something else, South Africa generates around 107 million tons of waste annually, with approximately 21% being diverted from landfill. What is always astonishing is that of the 10 million tons of food goes to waste every year, and that's like a third of the food that is produced. So a third of our food waste don't even make it to our table, which is always like a bit shocking to me if you think about that, and especially if you think about people going hungry at the same time. And half of the global plastic waste is from packaging, often just used once and thrown away within a few minutes afterwards. The reason single-use plastics are particularly problematic is because most of them can't be recycled. So these are probably like a good introduction into what Linus and Petro are going to talk about. So we've got two amazing speakers today. First up is going to be Linus Naik, and he's an environmentalist at heart and in practice, and he holds a doctorate in chemical engineering, which focused on technology deployment for sustainable urban development. He's currently employed as the group manager overseeing sustainability and business development for Don't Waste. And he's also an experienced builder and leader of impactful teams, specializing in sustainability strategy, project management, and client relations. Linus is currently working with his clients at the nexus of ESG, carbon zero waste, and the circular economy. So Linus will do an introduction around net zero waste, what it means, and what is available or what's happening in the market. And then he will be followed by Petro Myburgh, and she is a senior manager custodial services for the V&A waterfront. And she's got 15 years experience in the soft services industry and is super passionate about sustainability, managing resources and optimizing efficiency in the built environment. She has a really in-depth understanding of commercial waste management, deep involvement in the circularity, social impact, and emerging technology. And she was key to successful implementation and operation of the V&A Waterfront's on-site waste recovery and recycling center, and actively involved in the project called Solve that was launched in 2021. And I'm really keen to hear from her, like what does net zero waste mean in like a retail sector environment, and how do you get your tenants to actually comply with a lot of waste, and how do you manage to get your customers to reduce waste? I'm going to hand over to Linus to kick it off and give us an overview of net zero waste.
Yeah, well, first I have to say thank you, Marus, and for the platform to the Regenerative Collaborative. Thank you also for putting that Zimbabwean flag there on my introduction. I am first Zimbabwean, and then I am, but I think I've just crossed the Rubicon. I've made more than half my life in South Africa now. And maybe the first question on your competition later on should be, what does DFFE stand for? It's Forestries, Fishery and the Environment, but they do keep changing their name. In addition to my doctorate, which was in waste to energy, I'm also a net zero accredited professional with the Green Building Council. So I'll talk a little bit about, or I'll largely be referring to the Green Building Council's tools when it comes to ratings for net zero waste. But I think in general, we'll go into what it means and the relationship between waste and carbon, how waste arises, and currently what the dynamics look like in a place like South Africa. Instead of getting too technical, let's first start with how waste arises. What you see in front of you is taken from a supply chain management textbook, my supply chain management textbook. Essentially, it looks at how humans interact with our environment. So what we do is we extract resources. They go through primary and secondary production, and then there's opportunities to cycle it back, the value of that material back at every single point. So let's take, I'm looking around, I've got a plastic bottle on my desk. That's a PET bottle, not mine, but there is a PET bottle on my desk that essentially is made from extracted crude oil, probably somewhere in the Middle East. It goes through primary production, which is distillation. It then gets turned into the monomers, which is a polyethylene terephthalate, and then that is turned into a bottle filled with water and sold to a consumer. Now, depending on what the consumer does with it, they could reuse it to put something else inside it and transport that around, or they could recycle it and thereby save some of the extraction of the virgin material. Or if in the production there's a synergy between another industry using the byproducts, that's then called industrial symbiosis. You may have heard of the concept of circular economy. It is essentially trying to distill out the value in materials and offering services so that those materials can be looped as much as possible and reused so that we minimize the amount of waste. But waste does arise, and what fits into carbon and environmental metrics is pretty much as follows. So at every single stage of production, which I showed you earlier on the previous slide, you would get emissions, and those emissions are in the form of gaseous emissions or solid waste emissions. If you were to quantify every single one of them, it becomes very difficult and complex. So the common denominator for everything is tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which then got shortened to carbon. Those are largely broken up into 3 scopes. There's scope 4, which is void emissions, but by and large, we break it down to scope 1, which is direct emissions. That's anytime you use and make energy yourselves. So driving around in company vehicles or generating energy for on-site use, as we need to do a lot of now with our generators. Scope 2 should be by and large your majority of emissions, which are purchased electricity from the grid. And scope 3 is pretty much everything else. So they fall into different categories. What I've highlighted in the bottom corner is waste generated in operations. So that waste is then quantified and all the emissions are tabulated and divided by the common denominator, which is tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. I'll give you an example. If you were to throw away food waste, very well mentioned, Marlus, because food waste, which I'll get to in the next slide, is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It would degrade anaerobically inside a landfill to form methane and carbon dioxide. Methane gas has a carbon footprint which is 25 times that of carbon dioxide, or rather global warming potential. So 1 ton of methane, which is emitted from a landfill, is equivalent to 25 tons of carbon dioxide. So you would multiply everything out, use the common denominator and say that is equivalent to however many, let's say 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide, and that's your carbon footprint. Now, how much does waste actually contribute to that? Usually in a business and for a person, it's somewhere between 3 and 6%. So not insignificant, but also not small. You have the potential to reduce your carbon by about 5% if you are able to drive down your emissions from waste. What does the waste landscape in South Africa currently look like? Well, at least globally, we've seen some stats already. On the money was food waste in South Africa, about 10 million tons, and 33% of that is currently wasted. Now, that waste across that whole value chain, because it ends up in a landfill or degrades anaerobically, largely producing methane gas, contributes on the whole to about 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not just the food you throw away, it's across the whole value chain. Most of it is wasted before it gets to the consumer, but that doesn't mean that it's excluded from actually impacting the environment. In South Africa, I mean, we're fortunate to have a lot of recycling done locally, but that being said, we are still nested in a global economy. So I'll give you a for instance. Prior to 2018, an opportunity was seen by most of Western Europe and the Americas. China became a major manufacturing hub, and barges were making their way across with goods. And China had then a secondary industry filling those empty barges with recyclables initially, and then eventually waste. And because China was now sifting through waste from the first world, they said, we have had enough. We will take post-industrial source separated waste, as in if you've got cardboard from a manufacturing operation, but we are not going to take general waste, which would otherwise end up in a landfill anymore. Because of stockpiling and a couple of other issues, there was an initial glut, but eventually economic principles prevailed, and we ended up with a global drop in the value of recycling. Another thing happened very soon after that, and that was COVID. So I'm not sure whether you remember, but essentially disposal of waste was deemed fine, but recycling was not seen as an essential activity. So recycling industries were impacted then, and quite a few recyclers, unfortunately, went under in South Africa. We tend to be reestablishing ourselves now, but the value of recycling, and I'm sure Petro is going to go into this a bit more, isn't nearly what it used to be. And that creates a challenge when it comes to, the actual motivation to recycle and do the right thing. We're losing the value of material which we're extracting from the planet. So in general, waste is largely seen as in line with energy and water when you report it. The Green Building Council has 4 rating tools for net zero. Their net zero carbon tool is actually for energy, so that's measured in kilowatt hours. As I said earlier, in my opinion, waste is carbon, so they have differentiated waste. It's not reported under energy, and the carbon tool actually refers to energy. Water is in kiloliters, and waste is unique in that it is heterogeneous, so it's different all the time. It's seasonal. It's not metered. So with energy, you can look at a meter reading and say we've used so many kilowatt hours, and we can offset so many kilowatt hours by putting solar on our property. Water is the same with liters and kiloliters, but waste, you are largely you report on it, but you're relying on a third party. You'd usually appoint a waste service provider, like Don't Waste, to provide that waste management services and give you reports which you would then report on. And because it changes all the time, like the waste from one restaurant is not the same as another, and there's seasonality as well, the solutions which you have for waste tend to be varied. So, you can put solar to generate energy, but for waste, you really have to be smart and apply your mind when you think of what the best thing is for this site. So before we go into a little bit more detail, I thought I'd talk about what net zero waste is. And this is taken from the Green Building Council Net Zero Technical Manual. I've overlaid it with the waste hierarchy. So, when I was in junior school, I won't give away my age, but it was reduce, reuse, recycle. We have the 3 R's, but we have expanded that a bit. The best thing to do is actually avoiding. So I think the take-home message is that recycling is great, but it's not what the best solution is. Ideally, you're avoiding waste in the first place. Recovery refers primarily to energy recovery here, and then treat and dispose. I'm putting that against the net zero hierarchy, where you focus on efficiency first, which really does fall in line with the waste hierarchy. Then you do as much as you can on-site before you look for off-site solutions. And finally, there's the opportunity for waste offsets. Now, I'll take one moment here to talk about the difference between net zero and carbon neutral. So in a carbon neutral approach, you would simply take stock of your business, figure out what your carbon footprint is, and say, well, it's 50,000 tons. We're going to plant 50,000 trees, each generate 1 ton, and therefore we've offset everything. In the net zero approach, you really want to be more strategic. You're driving efficiency first, then doing as much as you can offsite, onsite, then offsite. And finally, when you can't do anything else, there's an opportunity for waste offsets. And I believe that the Green Building Council they're now specifying how much of that you can offset, which is great. As I mentioned, there are some challenges in the waste industry, and I'll go into 3 of those examples now. But I'm not all about what's wrong. I'll also give you some ideas on how we can fix it. And I think that there are platforms such as these which can play a crucial role in doing so. So the first thing is standard weights. I'll give you a for instance again. So there's 40 kilograms of plastic, 40 kilograms of cardboard, and 1 wheelie bin which is being disposed of. Company A will tell you that wheelie bin, we use a standard weight of 20 kgs, therefore your recycling is at 80%. Company D will tell you that it's at 55 kgs and therefore your recycling is at 59%. Now, if you've got a target of 70% diversion, depending on who your waste service provider is, you might have already met your target. This usually arises when you change your waste service providers. There's either seen a massive increase or a massive decrease in recycling performance, and it's largely due to standard weights. I think, this isn't unique to South Africa, and the academic in me would have said, why don't we just put a scale on every single site? And that's exactly what I said the first time I gave a presentation like this. I happened to be on the same panel as Sanjeev from ShopRite Checkers, and he said, Linus, how much is one of those scales? And I said, well, a platform scale is about 6,000 rands. And he said, well, just so you know, if we were to put this at every single one of our stores, it's a capital outlay of 30 million rands. And I was like, well, so maybe it's not practical. Maybe standard weights are here to stay. But what can we do to be better about it? Well, in the UK, the building owners and the property groups got tired of comparing apples with oranges. And so they said, look, they got together and they told their service providers proactively, they said, 1 240-litre bin of general waste, if you haven't taken out the organics, weighs 40 kgs or 60 kgs. And if you have taken out the organics, then it weighs 20. And 1 120-litre wheelie bin of organic waste weighs 80 kgs. And that's what you will use to report. And that then allows you to compare building performances. And once you know exactly how much waste you have, you can then see how you can drive efficiency and improve your recycling performance because you have a standard baseline. The other thing which happens is materials recovery facilities. Now, these aren't bad. And in fact, by and large, we have the green side of the scale in South Africa where recyclables are sorted into finalized grades at each site and they're weighed and quantified. The reason for this, obviously, is because recycling is generally an income stream. So we want to be accurate about exactly how much income we have, and therefore we're weighing on site. It's a product of the environment and the climate which we're trading in. By and large, and this has been tried out in South Africa, but in the first world, there are recovery facilities as middlemen. So unfinalized grades, so you'd have, let's say, dry mixed recycling or mixed food waste coming into a recovery facility. And the recovery facility is then able to report recycling performance, which it applies to all the sites. Now, site 1 might be doing very well at 90%, and site 2 might be at 4%, but they all get the standard recycling performance of the materials recovery facility. In fact, when we arrived in the UK, many clients actually thought that they were at zero waste to landfill just because their waste was going to a materials recovery facility. They didn't know that a large portion of that, depending on how it's operated, actually ends up in a landfill. So what this extra layer also allows for, unfortunately, is the ability to stockpile. So if you've got a yard or a facility, it has been customary, and I've come across this myself. I mean, in South Africa, there are only 2 net zero level 2 projects. Level 2 means operational waste. Level 1 is on the building. Level 2 is on the operational phase. The only 2 projects which have been registered since this rating tool has come out. Project 1 was making bricks in the Eastern Cape. It worked. They were at net zero waste, but the problem was the offtake of the bricks. So it hasn't been working since. Their certificate is obviously valid for what they were doing, and there's no contest there. It's just that it needs to be a sustainable solution, right? On the other hand, the second project which was registered was a gym which quantified the carbon footprint of the waste and then said that we're going to offset this by planting trees in Kariba, Zimbabwe. And as much as I love the fact that they were planting trees in Zimbabwe, I took a little bit of offense to the fact that we are separating waste from carbon, but now we're allowing to offset waste by planting trees to absorb the carbon. And planting trees can't be the solution to everything. In my humble opinion, you need to do something waste-related if you're going to have a waste offset. On that note, though, the other thing which happens in the industry is because you have these remote solutions like a brick maker in some remote part of the country, and you have this middleman, which is a recovery facility or a yard, some waste service providers are very happy to issue a recycling certificate and say, look, we're keeping it on site and we'll send it to the brick maker when they have availability, but we're going to recycle it, so here's your certificate. And to the Green Building Council's credit, they have updated their rating tool saying that you need to have a certificate from the recycler. So it has to actually be recycled by the recycler. You can't just get a certificate from, a waste management company telling you that it will be recycled at some future date. So some of the challenges, but also some of the solutions. Now I'll spend my last few minutes talking about how to actually get to net zero waste and what are the considerations. The first steps definitely has to be looking after your organics. Now, we highlighted right at the beginning what a challenge organics is, and you can leave it to the waste management company, but really valorizing your organics higher up in the value chain. So not waiting until the organic waste is mixed with all the other recyclables and contaminates it, but actually having separation higher up, pulling out organics at the tenant level or even the shopper's level will allow for the recyclables to not be contaminated, improving that recyclability. You're going to find a solution for organics, and then what is left over, honestly, depending on where you are, is between 10 and 30% of a recycling stream. So before I give some specifics, I would like to talk through this very quickly. What you have here is a diversion ratio across the x-axis and how cost and the carbon footprint are affected by it. Now, 50% is an arbitrary number there. It's somewhere between 40 and 60, and that 75 is the lower limit. It probably can go all the way up to 90. But essentially, getting to 50% with your standard grades, which is paper, plastic, glass, and metal, those are the ones you receive money for, is pretty much doable. With an organics intervention and by accessing it higher up the value chain, you not only, you do reduce your carbon footprint significantly because of the organics, but you will tend to increase your cost. It does come at a cost, and so you have to be prepared to pay for it if you want to do it. After that, it is going to cost a significant amount. And if you're telling me that you're stockpiling in Johannesburg to transport to a brick maker somewhere in the Eastern Cape or in the Western Cape, then, or a pyrolysis plant even in the Western Cape, then your carbon footprint is also going to go up. So I think there has to be a pragmatic and a practical end game here. And to its credit again, the Green Building Council has bought into this. For a net zero waste project, the target is no longer 100%. So, I mean, it might need to be renamed to a net 10 rating tool, but you can get to 90%. And in South Africa, that is acceptable for a net zero waste project, provided that you've made the attempt to, valorize as much as you can on site, and this sub minimum of 70%. This is my last slide. So essentially, Solutions are there, but they do depend on your region, your costs, and your volumes. So if you're close to a composting facility, great. It also depends, and I don't have it mentioned there, on your location in terms of legal compliance. So the Western Cape has a mandate to divert organic waste from landfill, 50% by last year and 100% by the end of 2027. So you don't have a choice. You're going to have to pay for it. And those solutions, I'll give you a quick example, and I promise not to steal your thunder, Petro, but Don't Waste was on site with the VNA waterfront from the time that the new recovery facility was built and all the way through COVID as well, until about a year or two ago. Essentially, just to illustrate this point, we tried 3 different options. There was a vermicomposting operation, New Horizons, which was an 80 plant, came online and then went offline. And we tried composting, and we were about to try something really, really innovative when COVID hit. And that was drying organic waste and then taking it, using that as animal feed or land application, but strategically for a waste to energy plant. I won't go into too much detail. I'll let Petro do that. But essentially, the take-home message here is that your solutions are varied. They are out there, but they are probably going to cost you a little bit of money. And that is it from me. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention.
Thanks, Linus. Can you let us know where we can get those recycled bricks?
There are a few companies out there.
You ready, Petro?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Petro Myburgh. I am Senior Manager for the VNA Waterfront, and me and my team look after custodial services. A lot of times I get questions like, what exactly is that and what does it entail? If you can think of a custodian, you're a caretaker. And so we look after everything that has to do with cleaning, hygiene, waste management, landscaping. I often joke and say if it's dirty, we do it. But I'm here to share our journey when it comes to waste in the commercial sector. So I have had the privilege to join the Waterfront in 2009, and I'm also an active member on our Sustainability Committee. And I recall probably in that time, around about Soccer World Cup, when sustainability was something in our organization that was driven by the operations department, and sustainability was a scary word. I am very happy to say that since 2010, sustainability is now ingrained in our business, and we don't have one department driving it. It comes naturally to all of us. So I think it's important to start off with context. And sometimes we make the assumption that people know the waterfront, but just to let you know that the waterfront is a precinct within Cape Town. We have over 800 tenants, over 24 million visitors on an annual basis, and over 3,500 people living on the property. That means to say that because we function independently, we in essence run a small municipality. As sustainability was very important to us, tracking since 2010, we were able to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions with 47%. This is quite significant if you consider that the property has grown with 110,000 square meters at the same time. Also, we were able to reduce our water consumption with 61% since 2010 as well. We drove that particularly hard, and during the days of day zero and when that was looming. It's also significant to note that the VNA Waterfront, being quite a popular tourist destination, we contribute about 2% of the Western Cape's economy. And just bringing it back to waste, in 2022 alone, we generated 6,400 tons of waste, of which 47% came from the food and beverage and hospitality sector. We have a team of over 90 people dedicated to waste management on a daily basis. That includes our waterways and our harbour, and 42% of all our waste that we generated in 2022 was diverted from landfill. So what does it take to manage the waste on the VNA property? So to start off with, we have over 386 collection points. That would incorporate all our office blocks, the marine and industrial sector, our hotels, and the retail sector. And within the retail component and the hospitality sector, there's over 80 restaurants on the property alone. All the waste that we collect goes to our on-site waste recovery centre for further sorting before it gets disposed of. Linus indicated already that this building was established and built in 2017, and we first started operating from that in 2018. Prior to that, we did not do on-site sorting, and we had a very basic separation process in place where we just separated our mixed recyclables from the waste destined for landfill. And I can definitely tell you with a great amount of certainty that we've had some valuable key learnings through the process of doing on-site sorting. And I do believe that if you want to have a realistic reflection of the character of your waste, that's the way to go. At our waste recovery centre, we have 3 sorting belts as well. And as I've mentioned before, about 96 people in total dedicated to waste management. This would include quality surveyors, it would include management, waste collectors front and back of house, as well as bin washers, bin tipper operators. We also have a fleet of 4 vehicles, and all they do all day long is drive around to the various collection points, especially at the food and beverage outlets and the hospitality sector. We would do up to 3 collections a day. And the team could sort up to 1,200 wheelie bins in sort of like an average period during the year. But up in festive season, considering that our waste could go up to 800 tons in a month, that team could easily be asked to sort and separate about 1,400 wheelie bins a day. Just a fun fact, our vehicles could travel up to 130 kilometers collectively on the property every day. So our waste gets separated on site, as I've mentioned before, and the recycling, we do on-site sorting, and then we also do on-site baling. So the recycling profile more or less looks as follows, where we have about 41% of our waste is glass, 40% is cardboard and paper and related products, 15% is plastic, and only 4% is metal and other categories of recyclable waste. We also separate our garden waste and our food waste. Our garden waste, we send off to a place called Zero to Landfill, where it gets turned into compost, and that would also include our dead animals. Particularly, excited is such a terrible word to use, but I'm pleased about that, because a couple of years ago, that was quite a challenge for us. As we have a working harbour, we have a huge colony of seals, and we do get a lot of wildlife on the property and the occasional dead seal. So we're very pleased that Melanie is able to incorporate that now into her waste stream. Then our food waste, on the other hand, also gets separated out, and that also gets composted off-site. And again, from this perspective, we are very happy that our composter enables us to include paper products like hand towels, tissue paper, and even soiled cardboard. And last but not least, the last tidbit of waste that's not recyclable is going to the Fissershoek landfill. So a couple of years ago, it became quite pertinent to us that we don't have a clear understanding of the character of our waste. And we started unpacking it even further by understanding what is the sources or the main sources of our waste and what does it look like. So, as I've mentioned before, 80 or over 80 eateries on this site. So 62% of our waste that goes to landfill comes from the food and beverage sector. So we've done a further analysis of this waste to landfill, and we have found that 76% of that waste to landfill is made up of food waste. 4% is attributed to plastics, and if we unpack that even further, unfortunately, 30% of the plastic waste that we found in the general waste stream was so badly contaminated that it's no longer recyclable. 6% is glass, 4% is paper, metal and textiles, a lot of hair nets, dishcloths, dish rags, those types of things, not a lot of clothing in that waste stream, and actually only 10% of all the waste that we were sending to landfill was made to land up at landfill. So that was quite a clear indication for us that there's a lot of work to be done. So we've always had separation at source guidelines for our tenants, but a couple of years ago, we intensified this process to such an extent that last year we appointed our own waste compliance officer. And the core focus of this person is to ensure that our tenants understand our waste separation guidelines and policies, that we offer them training, and that we also go around on a regular basis to see what support they need from us, how we can help, and how we can make sure that they stay on track. What we've learned in the process is that separation should not be an onerous task. So we try to keep it as simple as possible by requiring our tenants to separate general waste from organic waste from recyclables. Where it's possible, we also request that they keep their glass separate. This is purely because if it's mixed into your mixed recycling, when it gets tipped out onto the conveyor belt, sometimes the glass could crack, break, smash, and it could cause injury, and it is just really difficult to separate that out. We have also last year intensified our organic waste separation campaign, and so we launched the Grow Our Future bucket campaign, where our food and beverage tenants get issued with little 5-litre buckets that they keep separate for all their organic waste. So as I've mentioned, we offer training. We make sure that even when new tenants come online, that they are fully aware of all our waste separation requirements and that they stay on track with what we would want them to do. Our waste service provider is required to keep track and record of all the waste that is collected from the tenancies. As Linus have touched on, it is difficult because you can't walk around with a scale on your back. So we do apply the principle of average weights. Also, what we have found is that because it fluctuates depending on the character and the nature of your waste, we do quarterly assessments where we do a benchmarking just to make sure that we're on top of the actual weights. So for instance, at the moment, a wheelie bin standard for recyclables would weigh about 16 kilos, whereas general waste for landfill would be 36 kilos and pure organics would be up to 48 kilograms of waste. Also in 2015 already, we've launched a campaign in order to get our tenants to separate waste at source and to recycle more, where we have devised a pay as you generate or polluter pays principle. So for our tenants who recycle waste, we remove the waste free of charge. Organic waste, there's a minimal fee of 10 Rand per bin. Waste to landfill is slightly more expensive. It's 24 Rand a bin, and then we have a penalty fee of 40 Rand per bin. We are in the process of revising those rates. We have not increased those rates since we first launched the campaign, and so we're way out of whack and out of alignment with what City Council rates are at the moment. So we would definitely have to take a step back and see how we can change that. Also, what we are doing proactively is when we do tenant installations, especially for new food and beverage tenants, we make sure that we look at their policies, their layouts, and their floor plans within their kitchens to make sure that they facilitate separation at source. So apart from those interventions, at our on-site waste recovery centre in the last 6 months, we've also changed slightly how we do our waste separation. So prior to about 6 months ago, we would dedicate 1 conveyor belt to sort out only organic waste and 2 conveyor belts where we would sort out organics. We've changed that slightly now, where we've changed all 3 conveyor belts into being dirty. And we've seen remarkable improvements in our diversion ratios since we've implemented that. It is more challenging, I will agree, that if you go to our sites, very often the conveyor belts, it's more messy, it's more smelly, and it's really not a pleasant job. But we have been able to see that our average organics have increased from 20 tonnes a month to 140 tonnes a month. Bear in mind again that includes paper products, soiled cardboard, paper. Our recycling increased from 140 tonnes per month to 190 tonnes per month. I also want to pause there just that we are now able to do on-site baling of the actual recycling. And so a lot of the recyclables that we do send off-site or that we do send back into the market, there's no market value for, but we are able to separate it in any case. And our average diversion from 43% in 2022 year to date is standing on 59%. Because we also track and monitor our separation at source from the various tenancies, again, not an exact science, but just based on the average principles, we saw a 20% increase overall. Now, overall, that might not seem significant, but on a smaller scale, if you look at it, there are some tenancies that started on a 0% diversion ratio last year in March, where they're now achieving close to 68%, which we think is really significant. It is not cheap to do all of that, and as Linus have shown, that if you want to divert as much waste from landfill as possible, there is a price tag associated with it. So this table just shows you the various grades of waste when you consider garden waste versus food waste versus waste to landfill. And I can say with a great amount of certainty and confidence that it would have been a lot cheaper for us to just send our waste to landfill instead of separating out organic waste from the waste stream. It is really expensive, it weighs a lot, and it's really complex to transport. At one stage, when we were separating out organic waste, we would keep it in wheelie bins, but the challenge with that was that you needed a load of trips and a lot more trips to your recycler. And then if you keep a skip on site, it was sometimes challenging to fill the skip quick enough before it turns to a very smelly and mushy soup. And in many instances, then your organic recycler would not accept the waste just purely because it was considered poor grade. Also, when you consider the cost of separating waste versus the revenue comparison, it is important to note that the year 2020 is slightly out of whack, as Linus have mentioned. In 2020, it was a tough year, purely, again, because recycling was not considered essential service for a while. Also, we generated lower volumes of waste, but we agreed in principle to continue paying all our service providers. It was quite important for us that there would be no job losses and that would not impact on people's livelihoods. But if you look at the rest of the graph, you can see that the cost of labor really outweighs the revenue per kilo. I understand that it's not a simple calculation, and I am dumbing it down, but I can say with a great amount of certainty that, again, it costs us a hell of a lot more to recycle and divert waste from landfill than it would be just to send it to landfill. There are continuous challenges as well that we're facing. First and foremost, if I can focus on the food and beverage sector, bad design often poses a big challenge for us. And what I mean with that is that your tenant could have the best intentions, and they could say that they support your waste separation policies and guidelines. We could sign off plans for a new kitchen to be installed, where you can clearly see how they facilitate waste separation at source. When it comes to implementation, and before the new restaurant opens and you go on site for an inspection, you would often see that the allocated space for waste separation has fallen by the wayside because they needed more chip fryers or they wanted more space for other stuff. So it often poses a great challenge. Also, secondly, high staff turnover in the Western Cape is a continuous issue. Just as you've trained people, making sure that they understand the policies and the procedures and the guidelines, they find different jobs or they move back to other areas of the country where they originally came from, and then you have to start all over again. Linus have mentioned the fluctuating markets, and that was a big one for us. To give an example, the value of recycling, again, I appreciate that cardboard and plastic, glass all hold various values, but if we dump it down to an average rate per ton, in COVID, we saw the value of recycling drop from as much as 1,500 Rand per ton to as low as 300 Rand per ton, making it really difficult to still maintain a business case. Also, finding sustainable alternatives is still a big challenge. If I can pause on organic waste solutions for a moment, for each and every solution, there's either a price tag associated or there are just some barriers to entry. If we talk about biogas, for instance, the capital outlay that would have been required for us to convert our organic waste into gas would have been tremendous. And unfortunately, it would not be able to serve the entire precinct. As most of our food and beverage outlets gets fed from LP gas, it would have meant that we would have to implement a dual system, and that would just not have been cost efficient. Also, in certain instances, there are some organic recyclers where there are exclusions to the type of waste that they would accept, for instance, meat bones or oyster shells. And again, for us, we needed to find a solution that could really incorporate the bulk of our organic waste without requiring too much detailed sorting. The cost of transport, I think everybody will agree and understand that that is enormous, and it is a continuous challenge for us. And most recently now, again, we've received notifications of increases in the cost of transport that's way beyond CPI. And last but not least is the challenge around compliance. All our new tenants who comes on board require us to sign and agree to a green lease, but the policing of such is a full-time job, and it really requires a huge amount of resources and people dedicated to ensure compliance, and it is still something that's really, really difficult to maintain. So then I want to take a step back and walk away from waste and give a bigger overview of the V&A Waterfront strategy in building resilience and what we've seen over time as Cape Townians with water shortages and pandemics and shortage of water and looming droughts in the nearby future. We took a stance to see how we can build resilience, and so it was approved that we will be building our own desalination plant. It's already under construction, and we're hoping to have it operational by the middle of next year, which will be able to produce 3.3 megalitres of water per day. We also already established a black water treatment plant on site that processes 200 kilolitres of water per day that we are using for toilet flushing. The desalination plant coming online will require additional energy, and as we can all guess, at the moment, especially with the grid being under constraints, it's something that the country just cannot afford. Also, the associated greenhouse gas with the additional energy is something that we are not wanting to carry. So we're out on tender at the moment for additional solar PV panels to be installed on our Vic Wharf roof. And last but not least, we got approval from our shareholders to build our own waste to energy plant, which will convert the bulk of our waste into energy. So that's just in closing then to give you an overview, and please don't ask me too many technical questions about the waste to energy plant. I always feel a bit stupid almost when I share a room with all the engineers when they talk about waste to energy and what it will entail. But in a nutshell, with bar our glass, metal, and valuable recyclables, our waste will be broken down into tiny little pieces. It will go through a bit of a drying process, and then the pyrolysis will, the waste will be put into pyrolysis chamber in the absence of oxygen, where it will be converted into a syngas. This gas will be cleaned and it will be put through a massive generator, and in this way help us to generate the electricity that would be required to run our desalination plant. The plant is designed to process about 1,000 kilograms of waste, that is dry feed, and we do acknowledge, or we are understanding, that there will be about a 15% of residue. Best case scenario, we would be able to convert that into bricks, and worst case scenario, that would still be landing up at landfill. But that is our future plan. And in closing, just with regards to the waste to energy pyrolysis plant, we're in the process, we're open now for public review, which is closing the 3rd of July. And if all goes according to plan, and we are in a position to obtain both our waste management license as well as our atmospheric emissions license, the plant should be up and running within the first quarter of 2025. And until then, we will be dedicated and dedicating a lot of energy and resources going forward to still ensure that we do everything we can to separate waste at source and divert as much of our waste from landfill as possible. Thank you.
Wow, that's impressive, hey? That is really, really impressive what you've managed to achieve at the waterfront. All right, guys, this is time for, let me put on my camera as well. This is time to ask all your questions to the two speakers. I see this. So you can either put up your hand or you can put your questions in the chat box. Either way is fine. So there's There's a question from AJ. Is water desalination harmful to the marine ecology, or are the effects neglectable? I guess that one is for you, Petro.
Thank you, Marlies. I'll try my best to answer. As far as I understand, and to be clear, I'm not the technical lead for the desalination plant, but we will be taking water in from the one side of the bay, and the brine will be ejected on a completely opposite side of the bay. As we've had the benefit of the City Council's desalination plant a couple of years ago on site, we have an opportunity to learn from them. And the understanding is at the moment that there is no direct link or any data or evidence supporting that there would be a detrimental impact on the biodiversity of the ocean. What they are saying is that the amount of brine that will be ejected back into the harbour, because we have good currents and strong flow, it should be dissolved quite quickly and dispersed quite quickly. So over the long haul, there should be no impact on the biodiversity. But I invite anybody who has questions to just write to the V&A Waterfront's inquiries at vnawaterfront.co.za, and it should be answered then.
Great. I see there's a hand up from Adrian.
Why didn't the waterfront look at AWG, which is atmospheric water generation? It just seems so much better than desalination.
Adrian, again, I'm not the expert. We've run small trials on that, but I'm not quite sure why we opted to go for desalination rather than the atmospheric. Yes, I'm really not the expert on that. So Adrian, feel free. My contact details are shared. You can direct the question to me, and I will put you in touch with the relevant people who would be able to give you a better answer.
Thank you.
Great. Marty?
Yeah, guys, thanks a lot for the talk. I just I don't know whether I could call this the elephant in the room or I don't want to use the other term. What about actual human waste? Because we've spoken about all the other wastes, but if you added the tons and tons of human waste to these figures, isn't it actually something that we should be looking at? And I know there's lots of sort of not legal, but bylaws and other things that sometimes prevent us from doing that. So I don't know whether you guys have got any comment, but I really think in terms of net zero, that's one of the big wastes that isn't being talked about today.
Yeah, that's definitely the black water treatment, but go for it, Linus.
Yeah, I'll let Petro talk about the black water treatment, but I do have a few things to mention on this topic. So firstly, humans are very, very good at getting all the energy and water and nutrients out of food that we can. What's left over is really not good for anaerobic digestion if you're looking at that as a waste energy plant. Also, if you tally it up, the amount of dry, and I'll just use the words here. So if you were to take the output from a human over a year and dry it out, right? And you would end up with 20 kilograms of waste over an entire year. That's your check-in luggage for a plane, right? You could carry it around with you if you wanted to. Don't recommend it, but you could.
How do you know these statistics?
I'm trained as a chemical engineer in waste management, so yeah.
So if I can maybe just jump in there. I mean, if I look at how much the council charges me on a monthly basis to take away my sewage and process it, it can't only be 20 kilograms. I mean, that's almost impossible.
I said dry. So we do have waterborne sewage here in South Africa, as we do in most other countries, and they're charging you a disposal fee based on consumption fee. But again, I thought about going into politics, but I'm Zimbabwean and I will never succeed in South Africa. So I decided to try something else. But it's essentially, the yield which you're going to get from human waste isn't going to be as high. There are, as you said, laws and bylaws surrounding the treatment of human waste. The biggest success story, in my opinion, and there is opportunity for it, and I consulted the City of Cape Town when I was a full-time consultant. You have landfills right next to wastewater treatment plants. It happens in Vissershoek, it happens in Cape Flats and coastal park. They're right next to each other. You could get the anaerobic, you could get the gas from the wastewater treatment through that whole civil engineering process, and you could combine it with the landfill gas. And Bob's your uncle, you've got about 5 to 10 megawatt at each one of those sites, which is what we tried to build back in 2013. And the approval, if I'm correct, just went through last year. So things turn slowly, but they do happen. That's happening at the public wastewater treatment works.
Cool, thanks, Linus. And maybe before Petro answers again, I mean, because there were also talks of taking all of that, whether it's wet, dry waste of humans, and actually doing those fly breeding things and using them for meat instead of other meat. And, you know, there's so many other spin-offs. I don't know if there's any truth in any of those things, or all pie in the sky.
Do you mind if I unpack that very convoluted statement for you?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool. So there's a company called AgriProtein. AgriProtein is now called Inseco. They're taking waste food and they're growing black soldier fly larvae. Those black soldier fly larvae are seen as the nutrient source. So, you know, with worms, they're eating it and they're turning it into vermicompost. In this case, the black soldier fly larvae is the actual product. You can use it for chicken meal. You can use it to feed fishes. You can defat it, and you have something called mag oil, and then you're left with this desiccated maggot, which you can cook and eat yourself, or you can use the oil to cook with. But the point is, what they tried was to use human waste as the substrate instead of food waste. And as I said right at the beginning, humans tend to be very good at getting all the nutrient out. That project was called Biocycle. It was championed in Isipingo here in KZN, and it didn't work. They had to supplement with food waste.
Okay, but as we heard, there's generally enough food waste to be able to do that, so that's a good thing.
Correct, yeah.
Thanks for that. I don't know if Petro wants to add anything. I think she wanted to.
No, I think, thank you. Linus has said it all. I think from the V&A Waterfront's perspective, when we considered various alternatives for our energy, getting back to biogas, from our perspective, the V&A Waterfront's infrastructure is old, and in certain instances, it would have required a massive undertaking in chopping up roads and creating more dedicated lines. As I've mentioned before, there's a massive infrastructure for LP gas on site, and because biogas could not be combined with LP gas, it would have meant dual systems. So as much as we are committed to the environment and as we are continuously striving to find sustainable solutions, we do still have shareholders and we do still have to show return on investment. And when you talk about significant investments in terms of alternative treatments for waste, at the time when we looked at biogas as a solution, it was not economically feasible. And that's why we've opted to go for pyrolysis. Just on the wastewater treatment, it is a modular plant. We're very excited about it. It does not treat all our black water or all our sewage on site, but what we try to do here is just to see if a modular plant concept can work, and obviously use that information to either build on it and also to showcase to the city there might be other areas where it is possible. And so, we're very pleased at the moment about how our black water treatment plant is working. But it is important to note, though, that even treating black water to the irrigation standard or toilet flushing standard that we currently have, it again is an immensely difficult and challenging undertaking, and it does require a huge amount of resources and a dedicated, very qualified workforce. So it's not as easy as it sounds. We're able to do it, but in many instances, it's a very complex thing. But we're very excited to have it on our site.
Cool. Thanks for your answers. And maybe Linus must give us a detailed talk another time on that whole fly thing. Thanks.
Maybe that's for another day. Yes.
Yeah,
totally.
then I'll get my
nice topic. Yes, exactly. Great.
I would like to add one more thing, if that's okay, very quickly. So just to maybe bookend what Petro said about biogas not being viable. Now, I'm not going to make the case for biogas, but what I will say is that Biogas comes out at about 60% methane, and natural gas LPG is about 94, 96%. Biogas also can be used in most conventional appliances. They're actually very easily adaptable. But because of the infrastructure used to build the infrastructure for LPG gas, you would need to upgrade the biogas. And it's the upgrade of the biogas which would make it not economically viable. Upgrading biogas can be done in two ways: either cool it, which takes a lot of energy, or you have a membrane filtration, which gets the carbon dioxide, which is bigger molecules, out from the methane molecules. And the membrane is what's really, really expensive and what stops the whole thing from working economically.
Thanks for that explanation. You are clearly a chemical engineer. Very nice. There was a question from Jonathan. What quantity of greenhouse gas emissions are associated with your waste to energy facilities? Do you by any chance know that, Petro?
Unfortunately, no. No, I do not know that offhand. But again, I can reach out to the technical team and look into it.
Okay. Then there's a question from Rochelle. Please elaborate on your experience dealing with shop owners to source food waste. Were they supported? How often did they discard waste, and how often was it collected? Was the food waste used for AD process or fertilizer use?
Okay, I'm not entirely sure I understand the question completely, so I'll give an answer to the best of my ability. So because the V&A Waterfront have a multitude of tenancies, the waste management services as a whole is provided by us as the landlord. We do that for a couple of reasons, but mostly to ensure compliance with legislation and making sure that there's no illegal dumping. And you can imagine from a logistical perspective, if each tenancy had their own waste service provider and their own waste management processes in place, it would become quite chaotic very quickly. So when we talk about attitude around food waste, I think in general, most of the food waste generators are very open to finding alternatives and to look at separation at source. We've actually done a wonderful study now recently with Dr. Judy Mann from the V&A, from the aquarium, just around, I think, behaviors and how we can change behaviors over the long haul. But I suppose in a way what we're clearly seeing is that when South Africa started focusing on waste diversion from landfill, unfortunately, because recycling at the time held quite a good, strong market value, the focus was on recycling. And as Linus has indicated, it's back to front. If we started focusing on organic separation at first, the recycling would have fallen into place. And so it's really hard to change that mindset and to try and get compliance and to try and get people to look at food waste separation from that side. So that's touching on the post-consumer. Then when we talk about food waste in the sense of having something that's edible, something that's valuable, that could still be passed on to somebody else, we've done some investigations with various food rescue programs, and unfortunately it is a bit more challenging logistically than one can imagine. Whereas if you had a restaurant or a bakery where there are leftover food at the end of the day before they close shop, how they dispose of that. I'm pleased to say that there are a few of them that have good food rescue programs in place. Some of them do join forces with places like the Haven Night Shelter. But in many instances, the food rescue programs mostly wants your dry goods and stuff that still have a reasonable shelf life, as opposed to a hot loaf of bread. So that is still a bit of a challenge that we've not found a solution for. And I forgot the last part of the question, I'm sorry.
That's what it was used for, AD or fertilizer. But I think you mentioned already in your presentation where the food waste went.
Yes. So our food waste at the moment all goes for traditional composting. We've found that to be the most sustainable solution. As mentioned before, we tried agri-protein. We looked into worm farming. We looked into biogas, but at the end, the traditional composting methods for us is most suited for our demand, for our volumes, and for from a cost perspective.
Great. I was wondering if you have any advise if we, like, as an architect designing a new building, either a retail center or office buildings, like, are there sort of guidelines as to like how large the recycling area needs to be? How do you calculate the amount of waste coming out of an office building versus a restaurant? Are there any South African guidelines like that you could recommend for architects that could then assist them in like sizing and understanding waste better in buildings?
Are you asking Petro, who's recently built a waste area, or somebody who currently consults on designing waste areas?
Yeah, both of you can answer.
Linus, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So yes, there are heuristics. I mean, it largely depends on the GLA, the gross leasable area. And then we try to split it in between food waste producers and non-food waste producers. So when we get an idea of that the only two outliers then are gyms and cinemas, because those are very large but have very little waste. So once we get a tenant profile and the GLA, we can very well predict how much waste this is going to be. And after that, we can assist with the design of the waste area. It's something which we usually do gratis for a prospective client.
Yes, and then from my perspective, I think what we've seen time and time again is how lack of, so waste is like the stepchild of sustainability. Everybody thinks about how to conserve energy and how to save water, and waste is often left by the wayside. So when we in a waterfront design and build new buildings, because we have a high ratio of green rated buildings in our precinct, we have minimum requirements when we build, and that we have to achieve a 6-star rating for new builds. But when we look at tenant installations, or where you have a private build, let's use in a hotel for an example, what we often find is that the consultants and the people designing and developing a commercial kitchen or a hotel are not the actual operator. And very often, when the head chef or the person who's looking over operations on site gets involved, it's really too late. I'll use one of our luxury hotels as an example, where the chef wants to separate. She wants to do as much as possible in order to divert waste from landfill. But her kitchen is way up in the building. The space is really, really limited. And then they have to make use of a goods lift into the tiny little refuse area that's been allocated for them. So it is really difficult. And it is an ongoing conversation. In fact, I met somebody a while back who is in the manufacturing business of stainless steel countertops for industrial kitchens. And I posed the question to Silla, if you look at the scullery area, why is there only one hole for waste? It does not facilitate separation at source. There's nothing when you look at it. And I know that there's tremendous work done. Again, through SOLVE, we've done a lot of workshops now with restaurant owners within our precinct, but also inviting external stakeholders. And there's some beautiful stories of successful restaurants and chefs that are making huge progress in separation at source, but it is an ongoing challenge. And despite interventions, I can give you a list of tenancies. We go to there regularly, we train, we educate. You come back next week and the bucket that you've issued for organic waste will be used to rinse out lappies. So it's ongoing, it's continuous, it's tiresome, but we will not stop. It's something that we're determined to get right.
I'm hugely impressed. Like, I already struggle with the management of waste in my own building, let alone then.
It's not really complex. It's not complex. One of our big hotels, I've recently started the process, and it's magnificent. But it is you need a team of dedicated people that drives it and drives it consistently and hard. Again, I would say that I think if you start with organic waste, you're halfway through it. But what we often see is there's separation that takes place. You have good value recycling. And at the end of a shift, the barman empties all the coffee grounds and his lemon wedges and all the garnishes and everything from the drinks into one container over lovely plastic and cardboard and paper and other stuff that could have been recycled. And then at the end of the day, that lands up in landfill. So it is, it needs to just start simple and build from that. But you need to plan for it. You really need to be quite intentional about your layouts of your kitchens and your areas where you serve food in order to achieve it.
So Jennifer is asking if you request that waste to be she asked if the waste, if you're asking the tenants if waste is going to be cleaned by themselves, or how do you ensure that that washing process?
Oh, right. Yes. So washing is a bit of a challenge, and Linus, you could definitely support that. If you think about our volume, our team on site can handle up to 20 tons of waste a day. And so logistically, to try and clean plastic and recycling in order to save it and salvage it is unfortunately just not economically feasible. We do ask our tenants, we do give guidelines, but I must be honest, we found wonderful suppliers, and I have yet to have even a waste management company that was so exclusive about the quality of the waste that they wouldn't accept it. In general terms, paper that's slightly soiled or plastic that's slightly sticky is still perfectly acceptable. Our rule to our tenants is if it's dry, rather put it in your recycling waste stream and let the recyclers separate that out. But very often people think, it's not recyclable, and they'll just chuck it. And that is where the challenge comes in.
Especially for plastic grades. I mean, if you look at the plastics recycling process, it goes through something called a wash plant. So it gets cleaned itself anyway. The only times when we put staff on site to wash recyclables is when we want to illustrate the whole contamination issue. To say that, look, this could have been recyclable, but it's not because it was contaminated. And that's largely for paper grades. So yes.
Okay, thank you. There's one question from Rochelle. Since logistics are a big factor, have you considered setting up a small-scale food garden using food waste as a fertilizer and grey water on site? Rooftop food gardens, set up as a community cooperative.
Okay, I'll answer that very quickly. So at our own head office, we have our own little veggie garden where we put in back some of our office's waste. The scale and the volume of waste that we generate, if you can imagine 120 tons of food waste, we were asked even if we would consider on-site composting. The logistics around that in the V&A waterfront space is a commodity. And if our shareholders had to give up 100 square meters for, I don't know, a tenancy of sorts versus a veggie garden, I think I know what the answer would be. Not to say that they do not support sustainability, but in the long haul, it needs to be economically feasible. So at the moment, the amount of compost even that we require to maintain our gardens is not even a fraction of the amount of compost that would be generated from the amount of food waste that we have on site. So just from a logistics perspective, that again for us is not feasible.
I'm going to ask one question before I'm going to give the mic to Marty again. In terms of like legislation and municipal encouragement to retailers and offices, like is there anything innovative happening anywhere of the municipality side or national side?
Well, we've been speaking a lot about organic waste, and I touched on it in that very last slide. So Western Cape, as a province, has issued a directive that food waste is to be banned from landfills. There was a diversion target of 50% by the end of last year and 100% by the end of 2027. We anticipate that other municipalities will follow. What was difficult in the beginning was that the guidelines on how it was going to happen weren't really provided. And it was kind of left up to the private sector to just comply and come up with their own solutions. And then the question which I always have is, how are you going to monitor it and how are you going to measure it? How do you know? And it seems that the solution here is through reporting and through the provision of your own waste management plans. So you essentially come up with your strategy of avoiding the waste and you report on how much waste there is, and then you measure it against that. So that's how I understand that it's currently happening, at least in the Western Cape. And as I said, it's probably soon to follow. I mean, there's all these questions about what happens if it's mixed with other waste? Is it still organic waste? And how do you know that that organic waste came from that producer? And who's going to get the fine at the landfill, et cetera, et cetera? And I assume that's still being worked out. I was more critical in the beginning, but I am an eternal optimist, so I'm sure it will work itself out.
Okay. Marty?
Yeah, so if you noticed, I actually stuck my hand up just before that other person had asked their question out of the chat, but it went around washing plastic. So, for example, and I have arguments with my wife about this often, we get bacon or whatever the case is, whether you should wash it out and whether you waste more water and do actually more environmental damage wasting water trying to wash out a bacon packet. Or how you should actually do it. So it's just one thing. And then what other things, because there are always those, I think it was the Petro pack or something where you had the multiple layers of aluminium and paper and whatever, the Tetra pack, I think they were called.
Petro pack,
and
yeah.
they were recyclable. They became unrecyclable because certain plants were shut down. So maybe just an update on both of those, if you don't mind.
Sure. Can I ask you to elaborate? My mum's Muslim, so I've never eaten bacon. Is the bacon packet recyclable? And maybe you can give me another example, like if it's...
So bacon is, it's basically fairly fatty meat. So when you've taken it out, the inside of the bag is... sorry, something's going on the screen.
Like greasy, yeah.
Inside the bag is fairly greasy and whatever. And the actual way to really know it's clean is to fill it with hot water and then empty it out again. And I'm not too sure whether that water is being counterproductive in terms of recycling. And there's many other things like meaty type things.
So let me take a different example, which I'm familiar with. So a yogurt tub, right? Yogurt is it's pretty fatty, and when you're done with it, should you rinse it out and then put it with the recycling, or should you throw it for disposal if it is a recyclable grade, right? That's a similar sort of scenario.
So I'll tell you my answer for that is I actually let the dogs lick out the old yogurt tub and then I put it in recycling because then it's clean.
Oh, there you go. Right. Yeah. So look, you can't compromise your water and air quality at the expense of recycling. So I think it's a case-by-case basis for that one. To answer that one, I would probably not recycle that grade. I don't think it would be worth the water. So that's the short answer. Tetra Pak is a great scenario and case study for extended producer responsibility. We had a very poor rebate for Tetra Pak in South Africa for a long time, to a point where it was not economically viable to recycle. But since EPR regulations have come in and the PROs have been formed and the price has been pegged to be pretty high, and we're paying for it as consumers, the same way we pay a carbon tax, we're paying the tax on that EPR fee. Tetra Pak is now being recycled again widely across South Africa. So that is being recycled, and we've reintroduced it as a recycling grade across the board. So that's a success story and a good example, a good success story for extended producer responsibility.
And last one, things like foil chip packets, etc., because that's another one where we tend to get confusing information back.
Those are primarily not recyclable. Those should go with your not recyclables.
And is there pressure on those companies to actually change that packaging?
Yeah, look, Marlus, do I have a minute to talk about EPR quickly?
Yes, but Marty, that was your last question.
Okay, I promise I won't ask more.
So essentially the onus is on the, what we call the producer. And the producer is deemed as one of these three people. In the case of a brand like Nestle or Cadbury, it is the manufacturer because they're responsible for the packaging. In the case of an importer, it is the importer. And in the case of a house brand like Pick n Pay or Woolworths, it's the retailer. So they have the responsibility and they have to either join a PRO, form a PRO, or tell the DFFE how they're going to make sure that that waste is recycled. So that's EPR in a nutshell. And so you can expect that because it is packaging, there will be a mandate on promoting some solution for that.
And if I may add that stuffing a chip packet into a 2-liter Coke bottle as an eco brick and dumping it on the doorstep of a recycler does not make it go away. Unless there's a project dedicated for eco-bricks, it still remains plastic in a 2-litre Coke bottle, not going away. So just be mindful of that.
Great. Any closing comments from you guys? All good?
Yeah, I've always got something to say. Sorry. The people ask what is the future of net zero waste, and I think I'll just tie this up by saying what we wanted to really do with the V&A waterfront just before COVID. So there was this organic waste stream, and there was all this non-recyclable waste, and we had this idea of dehydrating the organic waste and then using it as a feed for the cement kilns. Cement kilns are generally registered to take waste, so they've got their license to use waste as an alternative energy source, and all those chip packets are great fuel for it, those non-recycled grades. The problem with organic waste was that it's too wet, and that reduces. But if it's dry, the calorific value is now amazing. So if you dry it out, then you could combine it with the non-recyclables, and you had the perfect alternative fuel for cement kilns, and that could actually be a net zero waste project. The problem is they're very far away.
Thank you. Petro?
I think just thank you for the audience and for the opportunity to share our learnings. We're always open to engage, to share. And if there are any people with further questions, suggestions, questions, or queries, they are very welcome to contact us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Then I'm going to close it off, just announcing our next events for next month. In July, we're talking about strategies for biodiverse cities, and we're going to have a panel of people. That's going to be very interesting. And then in August, we're talking circular economy and building materials. So those two topics are up. I think Lisette already shared the link to register for our next webinar. So if that speaks to you, please do register. So again, if there's anyone in the audience that wants to sponsor or knows a sponsor for our webinars, please let us know. It would be really much appreciated. The proceeds will go to the validation of the CPD. So if we can't get sponsors, we won't be able to offer the CPD points anymore. Then lastly, thank you so much, Linus and Petro. Really enjoyed the graphically amazing presentations, easy to follow and really well received. Thank you so much for offering your time and with us. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot again. So thank you so much for your participation. And from the emoticons flying around on the screen, I think the audience is definitely agreeing with me. And the last reminder to follow us on LinkedIn and Eventbrite. And then with that, I'm going to close off the webinar. Thank you all for attending, your participation, your questions. Really appreciate it. And see you next month. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Have a good evening. Yeah.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thanks.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.